Alireza Firouzja is an absolute blitz beast. His ability to find his way through tactical positions in time pressure is just out of this world, and we so often see his opponents getting burnt. But his opponent in this game was Super GM Teimour Radjabov from Azerbaijan. No slouch himself in Blitz, and also a man who's going to be playing in the candidates this June, where he'll be meeting Firouzja once again. But the game I'm looking at today, they played in Paris Blitz 2021. Firouzja had black, Teimour had white. Let's see what happened here. So we had d4 on the board, and we went in for this Queen's Gambit declined after these standard opening moves. And now Firouzja took on c4, the so-called Vienna variation. It's a Queen's Gambit accepted delayed variation. White goes e4 now. You don't have to do that. You can go pawn e3, but e4 is very aggressive, just what you want in a blitz game. And most commonly, black goes bishop to b4 here. But Firouzja went pawn to b5, a really aggressive way to play, immediately holding onto this pawn, but that can be taken with the knight, as we can see. So first Teimour pushes the pawn to e5, we had knight d5, and now he takes Alireza's pawn. So white's won a pawn, but is losing time, and I should say they haven't actually won a pawn until they recapture on c4. Materials level right now. Now Firouzja drops the knight back here, covering this pawn, and now knight c3 was played by Teimour. So at some point that knight wants to come back, cover these key squares in the centre, so Teimour does it sooner rather than later. Bishop e7 was now played, bishop e2, knight c6, we had castles from white, bishop to b7 here, bishop e3 covers the pawn, queen to d7 now prepares to bring a rook to the d file, and rook to c1 from white. And this is where Alireza plays one of his Firouzja specials. But before I reveal the move, if you're enjoying this video, do hit that like button to support, and if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, then consider doing so, joining our community, never missing a daily upload. So here Firouzja played pawn to g5, a really awesome concept. Now it's not actually sound, it doesn't work tactically, but who cares? I mean, what a great idea, just chucking this g-pawn, distracting one of these pieces so that you can then pick up on d4. Now the pawn was taken here with the bishop, he went rook to g8 immediately, and this starts to look really scary. So white captured that bishop, the knight recaptured, and if you run this with an engine, white's doing really well. 2.5 pawns better, but you have to find this move pawn to b3. I mean, there were other moves to keep some advantage, but this is the main move, and it's a deep idea. Now, you don't want to just say castle here, because white takes and sets up the big centre. So taking the pawn is the most natural, but you run into this really nice tactic of bishop to b5. That's the problem. And whether you block with the bishop here or you go with the pawn, the point is that white can now jump this knight into the e4 square, and you're coming into f6 with this deadly check, as we can see. So instead Teimour goes knight to e1 here. He's trying to cover this g2 square and also preparing bishop f3 to exchange this dangerous bishop. But this is a mistake, because now Firouzja can castle the king, which was played. Bishop f3 came, and now he picks up this d4 pawn. That was indefensible anyway. So the bishop captured on b7, king recaptures here, the queen came to f3 with check, and the knight blocked on c6. Now you could actually take this pawn on f7, then you can be jumping in and taking this pawn potentially, or with the queen, the rook could be coming to the f-file. It just looks suicidal to take that pawn with your queen and not develop pieces. So instead Radjabov goes knight to c2 here, hitting the black queen. And here Firouzja should just take this pawn actually. It's a key central pawn, and white would have to prove why they have compensation for the pawn. Instead of this, Firouzja went queen to d3 here, offering that exchange, but Radjabov correctly assesses he shouldn't take it. He goes knight e3, blocking the line of the attack, and now threatening to bring something to the d-file, but Firouzja misses this threat. So he's a bit focused here on his own plans. He wants to play knight to d4, attacking the queen, but he can't right now because it's pinned to the king. So that's why he goes knight to d5 first, now preparing knight d4. But the problem with this is he allows this move rook c to d1 here, and this is really powerful because the queen is getting kicked back. You don't have time to take on e5. This is maybe what Radja was fearful of, because if you take here, then yes, black is doing well after taking with check. But if you simply move the queen away to h5, now you're hitting the queen here, you're also hitting the unprotected knight, and this is better for white. So that's why black wouldn't have been able to play like that. But instead of going that move rook to c to d1 here, instead Radjabov went knight to e4. So what he's looking to do is bring the knight into c5 and fork the queen and king here. But Firouzja just simply ignores it. He plays knight to d4, an excellent move. And after this check comes, he goes king b6. So now white's got some problems. The queen is attacked, you're threatening to take with check. Your knight is also attacked. So you can't say pick up the pawn here, or you simply lose a knight. So that's why instead Radjabov goes for this move, queen takes on d5. He's thinking, okay, you take my queen, I'll take your queen. And this is actually what happened in the game. Although it is worth mentioning that Firouzja had a better continuation here. He could have thrown in this intermezzo of takes on f1. After king recaptures, then he takes the queen, and he's an exchange up with a better position. But we didn't have this. He took the queen immediately, white took here, the pawn recaptured, and now the game is very much still alive. So there's a threat to go knight e2 check here. So the rook came across, also attacked this pawn, but it does allow Firouzja to pick up this pawn now. So he goes to f3, taking advantage of the pin, and then comes into e5 here. Pawn f4 now came, kicking the knight, and now Firouzja throws in pawn to d4 here. A really nice Zwischenzug, because if you capture here, we take here, and we've got the connected passes, that's completely winning. So the knight has to move away, and now Firouzja has access to these squares, which he didn't have access to when the knight was on e3. So he jumps into g4, we had rook takes on d3, and pawn c5 now. So the material is level, yes, but black is for choice here because of the passed pawn, which is already on the 4th rank and coming quickly down the board. Now we had pawn h3 kicking the knight, it dropped back into f6, rook c1 came, pressuring here and here. Now we had knight e4, watch out for this tricky knight, there's a threat on f2 again to fork the rook. So we had king come into h2, pawn a5 now from Firouzja, so he's starting that queenside clamp. Pawn a3 from Teimour, pawn a4 from Firouzja, and now b3 came anyway, because after the captures, rook takes, now Teimour's getting the check in and generating a bit of counterplay on the queen side. He's also got a passed pawn of his own. Now we had pawn a4, the pawn came to d3, knight e3 was now played by Teimour, so now that the pawn's left this square, he comes back to blockade here and also looks at this d1 square where the pawn is headed. And now pawn to d2 is the best move here, just keeping on pushing that passed pawn. But after rook to a1, who knows what's going on here with this one coming very quickly down the board as well, because you're not actually promoting this yet when you've got these two pieces covering that square. So instead Firouzja preferred to bring his rook up the board here, he pressures this pawn, he also takes the c4 square a bit more, so pawn to a5 was played, now the other rook came to a8, and instead of defending the pawn like this, Teimour didn't want to go too passive, he plays rook to the b file here. So he wants Firouzja to take this pawn, and then he can start checking with rook b7. He played rook to a7 here, covering b7, the pawn advanced to a6, and now he brought his knight back, again covering this b7 square. So the rook came to c3, switching plans, attacking this pawn. I mean, the players are down to seconds here, let's not forget. Firouzja pushed that pawn to c4, but this allowed the other rook to come across and pressure this pawn here. So that pawn's dropping off the board, but in compensation, pawn d2 comes, and that's running through really fast this queening square, as we can see. So the knight captured here, Firouzja queened his pawn, and now it moves away with check. And it's amazing really that even though black has actually queened the pawn, white is actually doing really well after this next move, which is king d8. Looks so natural, but there's amazing tactics in the position now using this checking square of c6 here. So you could take this rook immediately. After the queen recaptures, we go like this, but instead we had knight c6 check first, the king moved away, and now the rook was captured like this. And black is now actually worse in this position, so best was to actually take the rook here, because after the knight recaptures, you pick up this pawn and you just have to grovel on a pawn down on the king side. But instead of going for this, Firouzja went queen a1, hitting both of the rooks. However, this allowed white to simply go takes on a7. Again, there's beautiful tactics here, which is that if the queen takes the rook, well, now there's knight b5. You're forking these two pieces, so protecting your own rook, hitting the queen, but also hitting the knight. So queen a5 could come, moving away, then we take with check, and after the king moves, pawn a7. A beautiful fortress here from the trio of pieces. You can't take this one, by the way, or we queen the pawn. But okay, it's really difficult to see in this position here that you can just let black take your rook by taking this one here. So instead the rook was protected, but now you can play rook takes on a6 and all of the tactics are gone for white here. So the knight came to b8 with check. Yes, it forks the king and wins the rook, but now after the queen recaptures, we've got queen and knight versus rooks and one pawn, which isn't level material. So we had a few more moves here. The rook checked on the e-file, king to f6 was played. This one came down to cut the king along this rank, but now Firouzja can get his knight back to this solid e6 square. So first he comes to f5, he hits that rook, and then jumps into e5. And we can see where this knight is remaneuvering to. The knight is such a good defender of the king. So rook h5 was played, hitting this pawn, but now Firouzja activates his queen with queen e2. He's hitting this rook, he's threatening knight f3 check, and that's why you can't take here. Or now queen f2 comes, and you're threatening knight f3 check, then mating on g1. If you try and cover that square, then knight e2 is destroying the position. So we didn't have takes on h7, instead king g3 was played. There was queen e3 check, king g4, knight e6. The rook came to check on the f-file, but after king g7, pawn g3, queen e1 was actually the final move of the game. Now I'm not sure if Teimour lost on time here or threw in the towel, but the position is completely gone now. The king is just too vulnerable, the queen and knight are just too good at attacking together. So say you try a move like rook e5 for example, well queen d1 check is powerful. If the king sidesteps here, then we can go knight to f8, and you're rerouting it to this g6 square with deadly effect. If you try and cover that with pawn f5, well then queen d4 check. You pick up this rook here. And there's many lines like that. This is just one example. If you enjoyed this game, then click here to watch the whole Paris Blitz playlist. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.